Of course, the trouble is, dearest pussy, that there's absolutely nothing new about violent and bloody crime. It's been around for thousands of years. Of course, these days we don't really have the tailor-made excuse that we might have had in the past. When you live in a society where life is nasty and brutish, and the government never misses an opportunity to make it even more so for you, then on those occasions when you do go berserk with the meat axe, you do at least have some justification in blaming it on society. And it was a nasty and brutish world. A world, just cover the cat's ears, where they were perfectly happy to bury a cat alive in the doorway of the house in order to stop witches and warlocks coming into the building. Think I'm exaggerating? Oh no. Look at that. A grisly reminder of a time when something as innocent as a pet cat could be used to send a friendless old spinster scratching and clawing to the gallows and the grave pit.
Do you admit that the devil has possessed you? The evidence we have here is enough. Guilty, guilty, guilty.
Most of us have grown up with the idea that for hundreds of years, right the way through the Middle Ages, any poor woman who was unfortunate enough to have excessive and unsightly facial hair and an uncorrected squint was likely to be taken up and torched at the drop of a witch's pointy hat. But across the whole of Europe, tens of thousands of men and women were sent to the stake on the authority of this book, the Malleus Maleficarum. This was a book that had been published in 1486, in which two Dominican friars had actually laid out the case against witchcraft. What these two people did was to make a linkage between witchcraft with its spells and incantations and devil worship. Once those two were married together, it gave the authorities all the power that they required to pursue and destroy what they perceived to be the threat of witchcraft. In England, witches were hanged and their corpses burned and scattered. Across the rest of Europe, they were burned alive as society pinned its deeper resentments on the outsider, pinned its darker fears on the people with no power to fight back. Just like today, Jews, Negroes, Asians, witches were just another of society's scapegoats. And in the golden reign of Gloriana, the great European witch hunt finally infected our shores. Tudor England, with all its magnificent buildings and breathtaking costumes, was a fully paid-up member of the Renaissance. Now that word just means rebirth. And that's because society liked to think that it had been born again into all the bright, sunlit world in which art and science could flourish unfettered by all the dark and superstitious ideas that had been kicking around in the medieval period. But it wasn't quite like that. As we'd moved into this new world, we'd actually brought with us a lot of the dark and unpleasant things that we like to convince ourselves we'd left behind. Remember, one of the charges against Anne Boleyn was that she'd practiced witchcraft on Henry VIII. And perhaps it had something to do with the fact that in 1563, England enacted a ferocious law against witchcraft.
The Act against conjurations, enchantments, and witchcrafts dealing with evil and wicked spirits, and the purging of the devil by all means, for which heresy the punishment be death by hanging.
Pretty well every year, the Queen takes herself and her courtiers off on a royal progress to escape the filth and the disease of London in high summer. London, in August and July and June, the last place in the world you'd want to be. And in the summer of 1582, one of the places they came to was St. Osyth Priory,
But they didn't just come for a jolly. They came because it gave them the opportunity to put the squeeze on members of local government who they felt weren't doing the business for them. And one of the things that they felt needed to be prosecuted more vigorously was the laws against witchcraft. And that gave a local JP, Brian Darcy, just the opportunity he needed to climb a few more feet up the greasy political pole.
Early in 1582, here in the village of St. Osyth in Essex, an elderly, cantankerous and sadly hump-backed old lady by the name of Ursula Kemp was seen to have a stand-up row with one of her neighbours, a young woman with a young child. During the course of the row, Ursula wagged her finger in her face and shouted, "You'll rue the day you ever fell out with me, young lady!" and then stomped off back to her own house. Well, it was a spat. Most people would have forgotten about it. Unfortunately, 3 months later, tragically, the young baby fell from its cradle, broke its neck and died. There were enough people in the village with grudges against Ursula that tongues began to wag, and she found herself accused of witchcraft. And this is the very place where they brought poor, crooked-back Ursula Kemp when they wanted to lock her up. Now, people came from miles around to see the witch. There's no interactive telly in those days, so this is the best you can do. She was a 9-day wonder. But I suspect there's another reason why people came to see Ursula Kemp. There's a great tradition of white witchcraft in this part of Essex back in those days, and we know that people came here to ask her advice on specific problems. One of those people was a butcher all the way from Walton on the Naze. He came because his wife was seriously ill and he wanted to know what was causing the illness. Ursula told him that if he went back home and discovered a woman with a lopsided face and a woodpile in the garden, and he found the woman with the lopsided face and the woodpile, well, that's when it stops being funny, because that implicated that poor woman, and so she was drawn into the net as well and put on trial as a witch. In such a climate of fear, any eccentric, inexplicable behaviour was likely to bring down an accusation. Elizabeth Bennet was reported to have diabolical fits whenever she baked bread. You can see that this part of Essex is still low-lying and marshy. And back in the 1580s it was even more so, and that may have been what caused Elizabeth Bennet's problems. You see, if you grow crops, wheat and barley, in an area which is terrifically damp, then there is a chance that those crops will develop a type of fungus called ergot. Now, if ergot gets into the food chain, it produces hallucinations and fits. The effect is pretty similar to the old hallucinogenic drug LSD. Elizabeth Bennet had her diabolical fits when she was baking bread. My money's on the fact that poor old Liz was on a trip. And while she tripped, Justice Darcy was systematically rounding up witches to stage a great show trial. Invoking the 1563 Act against conjurations, enchantments and witchcraft, His Worship Brian Darcy had 1 man and 12 women taken up and charged with sorcery. Once he had them safely behind bars, some of them here in these very cells below Colchester Castle, he commenced their interrogation. This man was a lawyer on the make. He was out for a conviction, and so using repeated and regular sessions, he amassed a body of evidence which he hoped would assure a conviction when the witches came before the assize court. He wasn't as successful as he would have hoped. Some of them went free, and some of them were imprisoned. But he was successful enough for all that. 4 of the women
were condemned to be taken hence to a place of execution and hanged by the neck until they were dead. Puritanical societies often use mass hysteria against those on its fringes, mental defectives, even women with too much to say for themselves. Here in Maidstone, in the summer of 1652, things had been happening which, for some reason, people didn't give them their ordinary explanations. There'd been ships lost at sea with valuable cargoes, nothing unusual in that. Cattle had died of the sort of illnesses that cattle have always died from, nothing unusual in that. 9 children in the town had died. That certainly wasn't unusual. The 17th century had an appallingly high child mortality rate. Everybody who had families lost children when they were young. But for some reason, all those things came together that summer, and they resulted in 10 local women being put on trial for their life for witchcraft.
Anne Ashby, Anne Martin, Mary Brown, Mildred Wright and Anne Wilson. You stand accused as practitioners of witchcraft and sorcery. You have freely confessed to numerous offences and heretical crimes, and you indicate that you have been consorting with the devil. Do you know the difference between good and evil?
Giles, what do you reckon the atmosphere was like in the courtroom, to be one of the accused? What would they have gone through?
It would have been absolutely terrifying. There would have been the clamour from the crowd. And also, these accused were normally of lowly status, and they would be questioned by educated people, by lawyers, by lords. It would have been absolutely terrifying.
Do you know the eternal battle which is waged against God's goodness and between that and the devil's wiles around us every day? It is a battle especially here and now.
17th century society was far more religious than we can imagine now, and had a far greater effect on people's lives. And people were as intelligent as modern people, people from our century, but the context was different.
And do you admit that the devil has possessed you?
I don't know the devil possesses me, but I do know the spirit that lives in me.
You know a spirit who lives within you? How do you know this is not the devil?
He's not a devil, he's called Rug. He comes out of my mouth like a mouse.
Is this not the clearest evidence yet of her possession by the devil? Has anyone else here seen this spirit called Rug like a mouse?
If someone was displaying bizarre behaviour or what could have been mental illness, they would have been identified as someone on the edge, on the fringe, on the outside, and someone to be scared of. So it's quite likely that if you are mentally ill, if you were mentally ill, you could be someone who'd be identified as a witch if the right circumstances arose.
A man I knew in London, he saw Rug coming from my mouth.
It was considered to be evidence of witchcraft if you were pricked with a pin and you didn't bleed. And so if you prick a wart, it's not really going to bleed. I mean, there's not a lot of capillaries in there, there's not a lot of blood in there.
They are clearly guilty of all the crimes of which they are accused. Anne Ashby, you have known the devil, guilty, and entertained the spirit Rug, guilty, and that you and Mildred Wright and Mary Brown did not bleed when pricked with a pin. Guilty, you must be destroyed, that this evil be destroyed with you.
During the Civil War, primitive fears boiled over and the scum came bubbling up. Meet the Witchfinder General, a sadist who got off on the scent of a woman's terror and the fortune it made him at 20 shillings the witch. Matty Hopkins was the son of an Essex vicar, and like many another mass murderer that would follow him, there was nothing in his Essex country childhood that even hinted at the horrors that he'd perpetrate when he became an adult. When he was a young man, he actually was heavily involved in what we call maritime insurance, because it was pretty basic back in those days. So much so, in fact, that owners of small ships sending precious cargoes to sea did everything they could to stack the odds in their favour. They'd regularly consult with necromancers, astrologers we call them, even on occasions the local wise woman, to try and find out what the chances were of them making a safe passage. And of course, on those occasions when their ships were lost at sea with all hands, there was no shortage of them to point the finger at known witches and to accuse them of using black magic to sink their ships in violent storms and sudden squalls. Hopkins, he wanted to build up a tidy little witch-finding team. He employed Goodwife Phillips because he needed someone to help examine the women. And he very cannily took on board John Stern. Stern was a fanatical Puritan, a man who saw this all as a crusade. He was engaged upon the work of the Lord, and woe betide any man that did the Lord's work negligently. When the three of them, known as the unspotted lambs of the Lord, when the three of them got you in their clutches, you were in trouble. Before committal for trial, the accused were bound hands to feet and swum to test their guilt. Sing, and you're innocent. Swim, and you're guilty. Heads we win, tails you lose. The witch hunt began in July of 1645, when Hopkins brought his first cases before the courts. Okay, it wasn't this court, but use your imagination. He actually appeared at the Chelmsford Assize, and he went there with 92 witnesses, all of them very carefully coached by Hopkins to be able to make statements which would enable the justices to convict the men and women who were brought before them on charges of witchcraft. And the fact that they were justices of the peace filled Hopkins with confidence. You see, at the height of the Civil War, the professional circuit judges weren't able to attend the assize. So the power went down the line to the amateur justices of the peace. They gave Hopkins free rein. They liked him. They liked the way he worked. And they felt confident enough in their newfound power to sentence 4 of the defendants to be hanged. Up until now, Hopkins had only really gone for people off the very bottom of the pile. People who couldn't fight back. Blimey, that's steep. But now, he clearly reckoned it was time to have a crack at someone a little bit higher up the tree, and coming to Suffolk gave him the ideal opportunity. The people of Brandeston loathed their 80-year-old vicar with a vengeance, literally. They informed Hopkins that he was a known sorcerer. So, having been well and truly fitted up by his parishioners, the vicar of Brandeston was brought here to Framlingham. Now, Hopkins was in the town, he was based here, and swimming people in batches down in the mere. So in due course, the poor old vicar went in as well. Now, that was not a pleasant experience for anybody, but for a man of his advanced years, well, I'll leave it to your imagination. And when they came out and was dried off, well, then the team got to work on him. The vicar of Brandeston was walked. Simple tortures are often the most effective tortures, and walking couldn't have been simpler. That's why it was Hopkins' favourite. All it consisted of was taking the victim, and supported by 2 of Hopkins' assistants, you kept them moving backwards and forwards. At the end of nearly 48 hours of continuous torture, John Lowes was prepared to put his hand up to almost anything, as would most of us. He signed a document stating that yes, he was a sorcerer, yes, he was a necromancer, and yes, he had been in league with the devil. He'd probably have even been prepared to admit to being a lifelong Ipswich Town supporter. Let's face it, after 48 hours of that sort of torture, most of us would sign anything.
In the midst of life, we are in death, earth to earth, ashes.
Now he knew that as a condemned witch, he wouldn't be given a Christian burial. The best that would happen is that the body would be stapled into the ground and quicklime heaped on it, or taken away and burnt. So he stood in the shadow of the gallows and recited his own burial service, recited it out loud so that everyone who saw and heard would know that there was no truth in the accusations of his witchcraft. And then, in the sure and certain knowledge of the resurrection of the body and life everlasting, he stepped out into the void.
Forever and ever. Amen.
In his short but savage reign of terror, Matthew Hopkins sent more innocent men and women to the gallows than any other witchfinder in English history. These were just ordinary men and women, people like you and me, who were just caught up in the net of one man's ruthless greed. And while you remember the 74 people that Matthew Hopkins left to have their life choked out of them at the rope's end, don't forget the 36 who were just left to rot in the filth and degradation of an English jail. And next week, my darling dearios, smugglers, in all their brutal savagery.